Last week I gave everybody homework. I asked you to dive into the wonder of the resurrection. To ponder it, to contemplate it, to wonder at it. How many of you have done your homework? Some of you? Any of you? Or did you just go back and say, yeah, life is life. It's as normal as it's always been. We have to be, as Christians, people who have the mystery and the wonder of the resurrection ever before us. That also means that we also have to have the reality of our death and our mortality ever before us. Because there's no resurrection without there first being the cross. There is no empty tomb without there first being a filled one. Now, very recently, in fact, just a few days ago, I had the opportunity to visit the storied city of New Orleans, Louisiana, and its famous St. Louis Street Cemetery number 1, which I believe was featured in that HBO show Tremaine about the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. But one of the defining characteristics of the city, as you may know, are its cemeteries, sometimes called cities of the dead. That's actually an old term, necropolis, right? They're built above ground in vaults of various shapes and sizes, some designed even to look, given a facade like the front of the person's home that they might have lived in life. Now, the reason that is given for this practice is usually that there's a very high water table in New Orleans. It's constantly in danger of flooding, and the ground is swampland, right? So if there's a flood or something like that, the bodies could possibly, the coffin could even rise up and wash away. And you don't want to see the coffins of your loved ones floating down the street during the rainy season. And apparently, this was a problem. So, by 1789, they began this practice of building vaults above ground and burying people there. Another reason, though, that became the practice was the Good Friday fire of 1788, which destroyed almost the entire city and killed many people. That's a story for another time. You know, Hurricane Katrina, believe it or not, is probably not even in the top 3 of worst disasters for that city when you look all the way back. It's a bad one, but maybe not the worst. But what you may not know is that these vaults actually come in 3 different methods or approaches. They're all basically the same construction, but they're used in different ways. First, there are family-owned vaults. So one family uses the same vault generation after generation. Another are kind of larger vaults that are built by burial societies for people who could not afford to buy their own family vault, because even real estate this small is at a premium in such a narrow area. And so these kind of beneficent societies came together and would pool their money together to build a kind of communal tombs or set of tombs with each other. And the third way in which they're used is, believe it or not, by rental. Yes, rental. Because the reason is that these tombs are all meant to be reused for multiple burials, for multiple generations of people. The bodies, once they're interred, and they're locked within with a special kind of lock, which you have to kind of know the combination for, these bodies will decay rapidly. The design of the vault is very similar to a brick oven that you might see, at your local Italian restaurant or something like that. And it creates the same kind of effect, so that over the course of, by tradition in the city, a year and a day, the body will have almost entirely decomposed, because that hot Louisiana sun hitting that brick oven heats up on the inside to usually at least 300 degrees or more during the day, and do that over the course of, with the long heat waves that they have there. And what you're left with at the end is pretty much ash and some bones and maybe some cinders of the coffin that was used. Very little is left. It's like a slow crematorium, which worked very well for a predominantly Catholic city, right, where cremation was not actually allowed until in the Catholic Church until very recently, still not permitted in the Orthodox Church. But it effectively cremated a person over the course of an entire year. Then after that year and a day, the vault oven, as it's called, is opened. Somebody crawls in, sweeps up the dust and the bones, puts them together, shows the family, here's the remains of your loved one, and then they can do what they want. Traditionally, there's a shaft or a chute in the back of the tomb that goes down into the deeper ground, and then it's poured into that with the rest of the family members and all mixed together. Or you might in an urn and take it at home and do what people do with urns, or you might, do what other people do, pour it in the river, take it out to sea, what have you. But in any case, it's cleaned out so that the next person can come along when the time comes and use it. So if funds are limited and you can't afford to have your own family vault, at least you can have a proper burial, proper Christian burial in this vault, and after a year and a day, you've paid your rent, you get your body out, you take it out and do what you're going to do with it. And that's kind of the economy of how death works in the fabled city of New Orleans. Now, the reason I share perhaps this seemingly macabre story, I brought some of the spirits with me back. They're knocking over icons today. The practice that we see there is really not that different from first century Judean burial practice. In fact, it's not very different from what we just read about in the gospel and how Jesus was buried. Similarly, in that time and place, being able to own your own family tomb in which to bury your dead was a sign of wealth, was a sign of privilege. But even those tombs were used similarly, kind of as a single affair. What would happen is, just like in modern New Orleans, a family member would be placed in the tomb for a time, perhaps a year, and then the family would return, collect the remains, which at that point might just be the bones, place them into a stone box, an ossuary box, bone box, literally, and then that box would be put on a shelf, hewn somewhere else in that tomb. And there, many generations of people would be buried that way. They recently have found a lot of these archaeological sites in Jerusalem as they dig deeper and so forth. And under the Holy Sepulchre, there is one of these kind of cavernous tomb-like arrangements as well. Now, this practice, of course, was then accepted in Christianity as a continuation of the Jewish practice, and in many places, it became quite dominant, quite popular, where grave burial might be difficult due to the terrain or due to the demand. So you have on Mount Athos and the monasteries and rocky terrains, this practice of burying the dead for only a small period and then exhuming them and placing them in ossuaries. In the monasteries in Mount Athos, they have whole rooms filled with the bones of the brothers, of the monks. And when they're brought back up, their name is written on their skull with the dates, and they're placed there, and the monks visit them, because that's their brothers. There's a continuation of the dead living with the people. Their social life has not ended, even if their physical life has ended, you could say. And of course, you may well know the catacombs of Paris, probably the world's largest ossuary, in which there are over 6 million sets of bones of people buried under the city streets there. Again, caused by immense demand and the difficulties of burial in such a tight space. So all of this helps us to understand the events that we read about at the end of every gospel. All the gospels talk about this, the burial of Christ. Today we read from Mark 15 and 16. We read that Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent council member, meaning he was a wealthy guy, He was himself waiting for the kingdom of God. Coming and taking courage, went into Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And Pilate marveled, he also had the wonder, that Jesus was already dead. And summoning the centurion, he asked him if he had been dead for some time. He probably at this point wasn't, maybe just an hour or two. Not more than that, for sure. So when he found out from the centurion, he granted the body to Joseph. Then he bought fine linen, took him down, wrapped him in the linen, and he laid him in a tomb which had been hewn out of the rock, and rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joses, observed where he was laid. It seems very simple at first, but think about all that's implied in this. In Matthew 27:60, we're given the additional bit of information about Joseph of Arimathea. It says, he laid the body of Jesus in his new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock, and he rolled a large stone against the door of the tomb and departed. And in Luke and John, they both add the phrase, it was a new tomb that no one had ever been laid in before. Now that goes to show you that the practice was not so unlike that in New Orleans. You have a wealthy man who can afford to have his own tomb, which he himself has built. You don't see too many new tombs being built in New Orleans. I got to see a very odd and unusual tomb, which has been designed in the St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 for Nick Cage, the actor. Apparently he plans on being buried there. And so it's become a kind of already a celebrity destination to visit the future grave. Okay. So he's a wealthy guy, he can afford to do that. And though we see that this also shows us that the tomb would be used again. Because it says it's a new tomb which no one had ever been laid in before. Well, you wouldn't say that unless the idea that other people would be laid in the tomb previously was normal. Right? Why else would they say in which no one had not yet been laid? In the United States, we would never say that because a grave is a grave, it's a single-use dwelling. One person goes in, and that's it. It's filled with the backhoe, it's done, and the only time it's ever opened up again is to take something out, or maybe in some places if you have an urn or something, they'll open it up and drop the urn down a little shaft. But that's it. You don't add another body into that coffin, into the vault. It's a one person per thing. That's usually by law. So the fact that Jesus, who was a poor man, we have no record of him really having any amount of wealth per se, he was really only borrowing the space, not even renting the space. But that does not diminish the noble gesture of the Arimathean, making him a second Tobit. Tobit is a figure from the Old Testament, Septuagint Old Testament. There's a book about him and his son. And he had the noble gesture of burying dead countrymen who had no other means of being buried. It was considered a great act of charity to help somebody be buried. And in this day and age, you can see why, right? How expensive funerals are. You're looking at $10,000 to $15,000 on average for a full burial in this country. You can get it down if you tighten things, but still, the average is $10,000 to $15,000. Around here, it's probably more. And he was putting himself at great risk by coming forward to ask from the authorities for this body of Jesus. But a lack of a proper burial for Jesus would have been seen by many, especially those who condemned him to death, as a vindication of their position. It would have been proof that Jesus was no prophet or holy man, because how would such a holy man die with such disgrace going unburied, or in a common grave, or thrown outside the city walls with the dogs, as it were? But all of this, they didn't understand. Maybe Joseph of Arimathea didn't even understand, because all of this was to fulfill a prophecy, a very specific prophecy about the Messiah himself from Isaiah 53, which speaks about the man of suffering, right? And it says, and starting in verse 8, he was taken from prison and from judgment, and who will declare his generation? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people he was stricken. And they made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich at his death, because he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. He was numbered among transgressors. He was put to death with thieves and criminals, but he was not buried like one of them, thrown out like garbage. He was buried with the rich, in the tomb of a wealthy man, Joseph of Arimathea. The act of the noble Joseph in asking Pilate for the body of Jesus upended the expectation of those evil men, that he would go unburied, and helped fulfill one of the important identifying scriptures about the Messiah. Now, all of this had to be done very hastily, of course, because the Sabbath, and it was the high holy day Sabbath, was approaching. Now, Jesus died at the 9th hour. He gave up his ghost, the spirit, at the 9th hour. That's about, at best, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, maybe a little later. And if you're talking the end of March or April, that means you only have about an hour and a half or 2 hours before the sunset. That's the beginning of the Sabbath. So they have to get all of this done. They have to run to Pilate, they have to get the permission. Pilate's got to go ask the centurion's got to report, then they got to go get the body, then they got to take the body to the tomb, lay it in the tomb, wrap it, and seal it, all before the Sabbath, all before the sun sets. Otherwise they're in violation of Jewish law. This then also explains 2 more details about the story: the seal and the myrrh-bearers. Because of the time constraints, the body of Jesus was not able to be properly prepared, as desired, of course, by his loving and devoted disciples, especially the women Mary, his mother, and the wealthier Mary Magdalene at the head. You know that Mary Magdalene was wealthy because it says that she ministered to the disciples through her own substance. That is, she supported the ministry of the disciples through her own income. Unlike Da Vinci Code and so forth, she was not a streetwalker. That's a mistake that comes later in the Middle Ages. Thus, these women designed to come back at the earliest possible moment that they could to finish the task to prepare the body. And the sooner the better, of course, because what did they expect? They expected decay to be setting in. And so they had to wait for at least the full entire cycle of the Sabbath day to pass. And so they came on the 3rd day, on the Sunday. Now the seal is another thing. On the stone was placed a seal. This is described only in Matthew 27:66, but it makes sense because just because there was a large stone rolled across the tomb, it doesn't mean that that was like when we fill in a grave, okay? That stone was meant to be rolled away again, right? Because they're going to come back at a later date, even if they had properly prepared him, after a year or more, and put those bones into the ossuary. So it's not meant to be a permanent closure. So to prevent that from being disturbed, they asked Pilate for a guard and a seal, which makes sense for the guards to do it, the Roman guards, because they're not bound by the Sabbath. They can go and do that during the Sabbath without violating Sabbath law for Gentiles. Now, the mystery here is the women knew that the stone was very large. How did they expect to get it open? Because when they got there, they were surprised at how large it would be and thought it was not going to be able for them to move it. But of course, by the time they got there, it had already been moved. The seal, then, is not something that was designed to keep the tomb from ever being reopened, but was kind of like what you might think of a police line around a crime scene. If any of you saw the film Risen that just came out this spring, our youth group went to see it. I liked how they depicted it. They describe it as ropes being drawn across the entrance and then a big gob of wax being pressed with the stamp of the Roman governor, just like you would seal a letter. okay? And that seal of the letter was meant so that you know if somebody had opened the letter and read it before you, right? So the tomb was sealed like that, so if the wax was broken or if the ropes had been cut, they knew somebody had been in there. That was a way to prevent tampering and to show evidence that something had happened if somebody had come along. And then they placed a guard at the tomb to make sure nobody did that. Anyone who would dare to break a seal marked with Roman authority was subject to punishment for that crime. Punishment probably of death. So it is with great amazement and fear then that the women find the tomb already open and Jesus not there. Entering the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a long white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him as he said to you." So they went out quickly and fled from the tomb, for they trembled and were amazed. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The fear and the silence, of course they said something to somebody, right? Because we all know that they went and told the other disciples, but they didn't tell anybody as they went. Because they were themselves afraid of being associated with what was probably a crime. Perhaps. Because they might be considered to be accomplices in whatever had happened. Maybe, they did not necessarily immediately believe this idea that he was risen and alive any more than the disciples did. They were filled with wonder and amazement and disbelief, perhaps for joy or just out of plain old disbelief. They couldn't understand what was being told to them. They expected to see Jesus again, yes. They expected to see his dead body. That's what they were going to do. But they did not find it. Perhaps and alarmed that something even worse had taken place, that somebody had taken his body for nefarious purposes, perhaps to defile it. None of this was going according to their plan. So we can understand Mary Magdalene's grief in John 20. It says, "She ran and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved," St. John, "and said to them, 'They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him.'" So she assumed that whatever this person meant, "he is not here, see where they laid him," means we took him. We took him somewhere. You're not going to get him. Only after Jesus then personally appears to Mary Magdalene herself, and that at first she doesn't even believe it, doesn't even recognize him, can't even see through her grief that who she is talking to is Jesus. Only then does she truly understand. So brothers and sisters, all of this I give you as just a way to kind of get a little more depth and perhaps appreciation of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, so that your wonder can grow, so that your understanding of how unusual this circumstance really was, not just intellectually, but to be there yourself, to go through that yourself, to seek a loved one that you had laid to rest and hope to have peace after such a terrible and traumatic way of death. Somebody who was so innocent and so pure, and to be beaten and abused and tortured and murdered so viciously, to desire nothing but peace for that person, and then to find out that even their rest had been disturbed. Can you imagine how heartbreaking that would be? The mother of this man, how would she feel to have her child's remains disturbed before they had even been properly, completely buried? This is the alarm, the fear, the amazement that is mixing with their grief. We need to be ready for the same in our lives. We need to have the same existential encounter with death. in our lives. We need to realize that we are going to see our loved ones again, and not just their bodies, not just their bones, not just their ashes. We are going to the same place, and eventually we are all going to have the same encounter with the risen Lord Jesus. Every single one of us. I don't think anybody is going to not see Jesus risen from the dead when their time comes. Are you ready for that amazement? Are you ready for the wonder? And are you filled with an appropriate amount of fear, a good fear, and maybe a disbelief for joy? This is what we're called to have every day of our life. The anticipation of our encounter with He who is not here, but is risen. Christ is risen.